I'm in the classroom at Horace Greeley High School in Brewster, New York. There's been a couple classes around the Apple II lab, and I'm struggling. These computers are beautiful. They absolutely stun me. They are a light in a very dark time in my life. We've been each given a floppy disk, and on that floppy disk we can load and save basic programs. I haven't quite yet discovered that BASIC is scratching around in the dirt, and there's an entire level of programming beneath it that will give me powers heretofore unknown. But we all have moments that are almost cinematic in our lives that we revisit and think about. And in my case, it was that one of the kids in the class had access to bulletin board era Apple II programs and had brought in one of the pirate discs that he had acquired in one of those trips. He had stuck a disk into the teacher's computer at the head of the class with the largest monitor aimed out over the room. And in 1 second, the machine booted, which was itself a miracle. But then it played its menu program, which had a beautiful star field, made sound, and gave you selections for all the pirated games that were on the floppy. The games themselves were amazing, but even at that time, I knew a miracle had happened with the menu program. I felt at 13 years old in the presence of some sort of digital god. And luckily for me, that god, that higher living being, had a name, because the menu program had a credit, and it called itself Beautiful Boot, and its creator was Mini Appler. The slack-jawed regard I had as I walked up to this program and stared at it almost an inch away from the monitor, trying to understand how all this magic was happening. I was astounded in my first moments of learning about Mini Appler. I admired and respected him for the next few decades, and now I've come to mourn him. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. There are two levels of admiration with a lot of computer programs. The first is what you are seeing on the screen or hearing. It sounds objectively beautiful. It looks objectively wonderful. You enjoy it as a work of art, as something to look at, as an impressive demonstration of what the computer is capable of. But then there's another level, when you find out the tricks and techniques that have put that computer program together. Beautiful Boot functions on those two levels beautifully, and additional ones besides. At its heart, it's a utility program. When you put files on a floppy, you need some sort of way of both booting the machine up and getting a listing. In the case of the Apple II, what it calls a catalog. The easiest way is to use the operating system level command. In the Apple II world, you type catalog and you get a listing of what the programs are. Almost since the beginning of home computers, there's been an entire range of utilities and programs that we call menu programs. They list out what the programs are, give you the option of doing various things to them, and function as signposts, waypoints, a presentation on where to go next. That presentation ranges from simplistic all the way to complicated. And in an area where so many menu programs were as simple as possible to get you on the way, Beautiful Boot rose beyond all of them. Not only was it beautiful, though, showing you a custom readable font on the Apple II along with a star field playing around in the background, Beautiful Boot started up in less than a second. Technically, that was the most impressive of all, but it would have taken me the rest of the school year to truly comprehend what was happening there. Regardless, the Beautiful Boot program was meant to be transferred from disk to disk, enabling you to make it the menu program for all of your floppies. Not only was it the most handsome of menu programs, it took up almost no space on the floppy disk, leaving you the maximum amount of space for your pirated wares, personal programs, or text files that you wanted to read. The creator of Beautiful Boot called himself Mini-Appler. I didn't get the joke in the name until a long time later, but I did find that name coming in and out of my life, on bulletin boards and on cracked programs. Mini-Appler was a member of the Midwest Pirates Guild, a group in the 612 area code that was cracking a whole variety of programs and making them very easy to find online. These handles were burned into our eyes as they appeared on where after where, and as my bulletin board system usage began, calling places local and long distance and learning how to get around paying for calling the other parts of the country, I was attracted to the numbers that started with 612. The 612 numbers meant Minneapolis, Minnesota, which, for reasons I have never understood, was a hotbed of bulletin boards, Apple software, and some really unique text files that I started to collect almost obsessively. Rising above all the bulletin boards was the Safehouse, a custom-written bulletin board with an incredible amount of character and multiple lines, which felt almost like alchemy, being able to call and interact with the other person on the other line, and what seemed like at the time to be a waterfall of messages being posted, maybe a dozen or 24 every single day, from people calling in, talking to each other, and taking advantage of their close geography to describe a world in enough detail that I, all the way in New York, felt a kinship. And I think it's really important to remember how much of a local flavor bulletin boards would have, describing locations that everybody knew because everybody also knew that everyone else was local. For us out-of-towners calling long distance via whatever methods we had dreamed up, we were assumed to understand that this pizza parlor, this street, or this location was something that everybody knew, and that teenage urge to fit in, to derive the context and not ask the questions and just hope that you'll figure it all out, was everywhere for me. In fact, as I would harvest all of the text files from the 612 boards, there were an entire range of them about something called Luding, Luding, some sort of sport that they engaged in, which had what could only be described as fan fiction. There was a board dedicated to Luding on the Safehouse. People would share their thoughts about it, and it was always kind of strange what they were describing. I couldn't quite get a handle on it, but still, at 14, I could think of nothing I'd rather do. I resolved, to whatever level resolve enters a teenager, that someday I would understand all of this world of Minneapolis, this world of the Midwest Pirates Guild, and, if possible, Mini-Appler. Fast forward, then, to the 2000s. I'm shooting the BBS documentary, and the entire horizon is open to me. I can look anybody up I want to, try to track down any obscure fact, any distant memory from my past. If somebody affected me in any way, I could make an effort to track them down, to talk to them, to ask them questions, and maybe get some closure to some open considerations. Sure, I'd be talking about the general history of bulletin boards, but the general history of bulletin boards was my own personal history. They filled me with inspiration, a sense of a world outside of what was closing in on me, and they gave me, just for the moment I needed, that reconsideration of who I was and what I could be. It was in this flood of research and reaching out that I was able to contact Sinbad Sailor, who told me he would love to host me for an evening and talk about the good old BBS days. And so, on one of my very ill-advised multi-city driving trips that I took for the BBS documentary, I found myself in Minneapolis, in the home of Sinbad Sailor, and with a little bit of effort, a few phone calls back and forth, Minneapolis showed up. Minneapolis' name was Matthew Dornquist. He had long ago outed himself online as being Minneapolis and was more than happy to talk about that time. He was strikingly handsome, the kind of person who would be cast as the prince in some sort of play. And with my camera set up in Sinbad Sailor's living room, I interviewed both of them for hours. Because this was more than just an interview for me. This was sitting down and talking to people I literally worshipped. People who had come through my Apple II and had crack screens that told me they knew more than I did, but they were willing to share their knowledge, to give me copies of whatever they had, and that there was so much more out there, so much to learn, and so much to do. The interview was about bulletin board systems, but I also asked them what exactly Luding was. What was the sport, the activity that I didn't understand all the way back in New York? And they told me. Luding had come from the fact that there was a flagpole near where they all lived that they could disconnect the bottom of and swing around on, like a maypole or a rope swing, and the ground came away from a small hill on the flagpole, which meant you could run and swing yourself out into the air. And they had built an entire mythology about it online, something they referenced, something they said they could share, and a signature they'd put at the bottom of their messages on the BBS. I'd been ensnared in it, and as they walked through this little sport that they had written text files about over 20 years previously, I felt a little box in my mind, closing up and being given a beautiful little bow. Matthew Dornquist had created Beautiful Boot when he was 17 years old, utilizing routines he had found from games and then using other skills he picked up working in assembly language to be able to make it as small as possible in a sector or less, enabling it to take the minimum amount of space and boot in the quickest amount of time that he could muster. Years and years later, he had posted the full source code to Beautiful Boot, along with an explanation of what his thinking was and a weird sort of admiration that he was so focused on this at so young an age. But in the expanse of time and perspective, it turns out that Beautiful Boot was just one confident step on a journey of code and leadership that Matthew followed for the rest of his life. The rise of Facebook in the latter half of the 2000s meant that I could be on there and connect to a lot of people who were in the BBS documentary. This gave me insight into how their lives were going and memories they had, either ones that I had brought up or ones they were discovering for themselves. I'd learned about their families, about their careers, about what excited them and what part BBSes played in making them who they were. And Matt Dornquist had gone on to create not only programs for the Apple II, including a digitizer named Parrot and what may be one of the first rich online clients, HBBS, but he had continued his work through college and beyond, becoming not just a top-flight developer, but as I discovered looking back, a top-quality mentor, leading people for a company, but also collaborating with others, teaching them what he knew, and then letting them guide themselves to the next step. And as CEO, he did something that I always admire. He recognized when, as the leader, he needed to transition, to give it to somebody to take the company to the next level, and he did so. not out of scandal or age, but because he knew it was the right thing at the right time. Through all of this, his success, his accomplishments only grew. He traveled the world, he took care of his family, he came from Minneapolis to New York, lived there, and then moved back to Minneapolis after taking some time off, and was beginning a journey of reflection and of historical research into his own life and the things that had made him what he was. He had purchased an Applesauce flux reader. He was beginning to image his old floppies. He appeared on the Applesauce Discord, and day after day was beginning to ask deeper and deeper questions on how to work with the code and how to ensure he had the most accurate versions of his own historical work to provide to the world. It occurred to me that he was a boundless source of knowledge, and that this was an opportunity to sit with him, to chronicle exactly what he knew and be able to provide it to generations beyond. And so it was that I wrote him a paragraph or two on the Discord, asking him to consider sitting with us, talking about the times he had lived through and what lessons he had, and working with him to catalog everything that he had collected and what it meant, and give him that extra energy and support he might need to work through his own legacy. An hour after I posted that, one of the members of the Discord informed me that Matthew Dornquist had died yesterday. This seemed to me, like it often does, to be a mistake, some sort of conflagration of somebody else's name and not understanding that Matthew Dornquist was just in his 50s. This couldn't be the same person. You were reading something somewhere, a bad match. You weren't finding the same person I admired and had known all my life. But as I found his Facebook page, it became abundantly clear that of natural causes, his life had just ended. His family was already building a small scaffolding of support for people to help them, to help remember who their father, their husband, was. Family and friends and acquaintances and employees and co-workers all began flooding onto his page, giving testimony to how important Matthew had been to them, of the moments he had given. There are many important stories to who we are, but among the most important are the tales told in our absence, the ones that come because people feel the world needs to know how they were being touched by the actions you took, the words you said, and the moments you give. And if all that could be converted into some sort of currency, then I will assure you that the words that were written tells me that there were nothing but gold coins left behind Matthew in his wake. The time that Matt had given to my documentary and the users of Applesauce who were trying to work with him to make his old discs readable were just one small sliver in a bursting star, a supernova of light as everyone came together. We are technical people. We want to know why. We need to have a series of explanations about what happened, what was going on. Regardless, from my distant vantage point, far away from Matt and all of his life that he was living, it's clear that even up to the end, he was living it to the fullest, with a family that loved him, with people who admired him, with collaborators over the decades who looked up to him as a mentor, as a parental figure, as a guide in their own lives. And that may be the most beautiful thing of all. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Mark Pilgrim, Emilio Oliveira, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Matt Reynolds, John Sturm, Trixie the Cat, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Manxalot, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere, who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I could confound myself thinking about how, if I'd only asked Matt for some sort of information dump months before I did, there might be an entire body of knowledge that we didn't have before. But the fact is, so much of what Matt has done is out there. Thanks to his forward-looking spirit and the fact that he was dedicated to teaching others as he lived his own life, we have been gifted with an incredible level of stories, source code, and knowledge. Minneapolis will live on.